Hi, so I'm Richard from Simply. I've been in the industry for 23 years now, so a little bit about me that, I've come originally from an audio background. I was a musician, I was a music producer, I did engineering and mastering, as well as having various hobbies in creative fields such as photography, did a little bit of casual video editing for people over the years. So, I've been involved in all elements of creative production, whether it be one-man bands, whether it be production companies. We've worked with some of the largest sports televised producers and broadcasters in the world, some of the big studios and content creators as well. And one of the things that we're still finding at all shows and whenever I meet people at events is a surprising unawareness of actually the underlying technology that supports the products and storage solutions in particular that people use. People understand maybe how they connect, whether that's USB or Thunderbolt, or it's a network interface, or it's a fiber channel interface, and maybe how it's shared or how it's worked with. Things like RAID technology is protecting their data against failures of drives, whether that be a hard disk drive or an SSD, etc. But there's a huge lack of understanding when it comes to how do I really back up, or how do I archive, how do I preserve my content for a long time? And, in the past, I came from an era where music studios were just starting to finally go fully digital. Tape was becoming far less common. Pro Tools was going hard disk recording for the mainstream. Computer technology was accelerating to the point where you could do so much more in software. You were buying less outboard hardware. And video then went tapeless not long after that. So now we're basically coming back from, music recordings, we're coming back from video shoots, photo shoots, etc. We no longer have that tangible tape, that kind of source master, that original negative that you could put on the shelf and go back to that tape, go back to that film at quite a long part in the future. Yes, you might have had some degradation to the tape. It may not be in quite as good condition. Lots of old films from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, we've all seen how they've been restored at some point in the last kind of 30, 40 years, etc. So, you always had that option. But if I'm coming back with data on hard disk drives, on SSDs, on memory cards, and I'm offloading that and then erasing those source pieces of media, what am I doing with it? And a lot of people are just putting that onto hard disk drives or SSDs and putting them in cupboards. I'm constantly meeting countless people that have got 40, 50 drives sat in a cupboard, and they assume that those drives are fine. And then they'll get them out periodically, maybe if there's someone that's a little bit conscious about the technology, and they will spin them up. They'll turn them on and just check that they power up and the drive spins up, and they'll go, oh, great, that works. They don't check any of the data on it. Same with SSDs, people might power them on, but they're not checking the data integrity of that. And that's where, it's probably worth explaining a little bit about how a hard disk works. So a hard disk drive, that's the correct name, hard disk drive, hence why we call it an HDD. It is a spinning disk. It is a glass substrate disk. And if you imagine that is essentially a bit like a vinyl record, so it's got lots of grooves in it, and each one of those grooves essentially has, if you imagine it like a grain of rice, but it's magnetic. And if that grain of rice is one way up, it's a 0. If it's the other way up, it's a 1. And basically the actuator in a hard disk drive, which is the arm that flies across this spinning disk with the read-write head, that is basically just using magnetism to flip those grains of rice to program your ones and zeros, your binary digital data. The technology in here is absolutely fascinating. And a lot of people say about rocket science, hard disk drive technology is probably far more advanced than rocket science, because if I give you an example of how close that actuator, that arm flies across these spinning disks, it must never touch those disks. So if it does, that's game over. You've lost all your data pretty much. But your fingernails have grown more in the last second than how close that is without actually physically having to touch it. And, if we're thinking about magnetism and these drives, the longer I don't have these drives turned on, these magnetism levels are dropping. And you're always susceptible to those, simple errors. Those grains of rice just will flip. There's nothing consistently ensuring that they're the correct way round. So that might well be that you have a bad pixel in a photo. It might be you've got a bit of or clicks in some audio files. Could be a bad frame or a glitch in a video file. Or it'll be that that file just doesn't open anymore. Or maybe that folder structure doesn't open anymore. Or maybe you've actually just got widespread data corruption across the entire drive, that your data is just gone. So hard disk drives are not an archive format. There's actually been quite a few articles recently in music magazines. I know Mix and Wired have recently covered this, that people like Iron Mountain have actually been going back and getting all of these hard drives out of the cupboards that have been given to them for safe storage from the 90s and early 2000s. And most of these drives are not working. They're either physically not spinning up, or when they spin up, the data is just not there. And SSDs are not the answer either. An SSD, relies on power going through the memory cells to retain the charge in the flash and to keep the data going. If you really drill into the technology of SSDs, the longer that they're not powered on, the more likely you are just to have very widespread data loss or data corruption. These drives are designed for your working production storage. They are designed for how you immediately ingest footage, how you immediately back it up, how you work off it, how you implement these technologies into RAID systems or object storage systems for, kind of all of these kind of working productions. But LTO tape, linear tape open, is a consortium. It's an open standard. It's now been around for 24 years. The first generation launched in 2000. And this is basically what that tape is. We're in the 9th generation of technology now. It's a magnetic tape, but this is designed for a 30-year shelf life. The integrity of the media that you write to it, providing that you verified, the copy that was written, you should be good for 30 years. So writing 2 copies of this is a really easy way to provide that kind of long-term archive security. Key things with tape, it's not a random read and write piece of media, it's a linear piece of media. So it can't get infected by malware and ransomware. It's giving you an air gap to your primary storage that is susceptible to malicious attack or ransomware and things like that. And tape really offers that, it's cheap. This is the other key thing. Cost per gigabyte, it's way cheaper than any other form of storage. So the latest LTO 9 generation is actually 18 terabytes per tape. If you can actually compress the data, that actually can go up to 45 terabytes of tape. But really for us content creators, videographers, photographers, etc., kind of film production companies, that's not really relevant because you're not going to compress that data. But an 18 terabyte tape is, around £100. It's not expensive, that kind of bit over €100. If you think, can you get an 18 terabyte hard drive for anything remotely close to that? No, you can't. And a big misconception around tape is actually the performance. So a half-height tape drive can actually read and write to one of these at around about 300 megabytes a second natively. A full-height LTO 9 tape drive can actually be doing that at nearer 400 megabytes per second, which is 33% faster. Now, if I actually think about a single standalone hard disk drive, the sustained aggregate performance with various different types of files of a regular hard drive is really probably not much more than 100 megabytes a second. So tape can actually be, almost 3 or potentially up to 4 times faster. It's a linear format. You're never going to work off this. This is, I come back from a shoot, my first point of call is to archive data to this tape, to back it up to a tape. Take my original source media and write my new digital negative to this tape. That's my safety net, that's my security. Then I'm going to be working off my HDDs, my SSDs, my RAID storage, my cloud services for all my production. And then when I finish my production, then I'm going to be archiving all my finished assets to an LTO tape. And then I can free up that space on my primary storage, my working storage, at the point where I'm not likely to need to go back to that content, but then I can always go back to my LTO copy. Now, some people that are familiar with LTO might have heard, well, LTO generations go on, and when there's new drives, the old drives get discontinued and I can't access it. And that is very true, and it's something that we openly talk about at Simply to our customers, about managing that migration of media over periods of time. And the reality is that's what you have to do to ensure in a digital world your content is preserved for the long term. The fact that this is designed for a 30-year shelf life, it's unlikely I will go back to this in 30 years, pick up this tape and put it in a tape drive, because chances are I won't have a tape drive available then that could read this. The key thing is maybe in 10 to 15 years, I think about what have I got on old generations of tape? What tape drives do I still have access to that can read those tapes? And then what is the latest generation of LTO that's available? And then you start doing a migration. You do that consolidation. And when you do that, you have a massive consolidation of the number of tapes that you have as well. For example, LTO9 is 18 terabytes a tape. If I go back, LTO8 is 12, LTO7 is 6. So even if I move from 7 to 9, I can essentially fit 3 tapes onto one. But people that are really moving to 9 from a much older generation might be coming from LTO6 or something, which is 2.5 terabytes a tape. So you're getting this huge consolidation of all the tapes you had before onto kind of one new tape. But you're never under pressure to do that very, very quickly. Realistically, I say it's 10 to 15 years is realistically the window where you're probably going to have to start thinking about this. So LTO is a really interesting technology that a lot of people don't really think about, and a lot of people, particularly since COVID, have just gone, I'm just going cloud. I've got my AWS subscriptions, I've got my Azure subscriptions, maybe I'm looking for someone a bit more cost effective like Wasabi or you're using Backblaze. And the cloud is great, but it is an ongoing cost, and the data is not in your possession. And I do a lot of talks at various trade shows around storage technologies and workflows, and it's not saying this is better than that. The key thing with storage is to understand the technology behind everything that you might be using and everything that you could potentially use. Thinking about your workflow and going, well, where is HDD, SSD, RAID system, shared storage, cloud storage, LTO storage, where does that fit into my workflow? What is best for me? What is most appropriate for me and the way I work or the way my company or facility works? And particularly around the cloud, if you actually look at all of the benefits of the cloud, they are amazing. It is somewhere else, someone else is providing storage for you. Therefore, it is off-site. It's giving you that disaster recovery if you have a fire or flood or burglary or something like that. You've got that other location. Someone else is responsible for looking after it. You're not down to having to manage this. It's a managed service. It's not a capital expenditure. You don't have to pay a lot of money up front. It's a subscription OPEX cost. Et cetera, et cetera. You can access it from somewhere else in the world. You don't have to be on premise. But then I can start looking at all of these things and go, well, actually, these are all negative. It is somewhere else. It's not in my building. So speed connectivity. Someone else could access it from the other world. Someone else is hosting it. How secure is it? How liable is it to outages? What if my internet service goes down? What if they have an outage? What if they get attacked by ransomware or malware and things? And these things do happen. So, it's really important just to consider what balance works for you. And certainly tape is the best way and most cost-effective way for keeping a large amount of content for a long period of time, and actually just stop spending lots of money on buying more drives, buying more RAIDs, which all take power, all take space.